It's May 1908, and countless bodies were being dug up on a farm in Porte, Indiana. 2 bodies have been identified, Andrew Hugeling and Ola Budsberg. A 3rd body was being identified, and this revealed just how evil Belle Gunness really was. Welcome to Episode 4, The Life and Death of Jennie Olsen. Jennie Olsen's sister, Mrs. Olander, who was 23, was beside herself and couldn't bring herself to look at the body of what was thought to be Jennie. Other neighbors had already identified Jennie, but LaPorte's coroner, Charles S. Mack, needed her sister to do it. Mrs. Olander was quoted saying, "I can't help feeling it is my sister, and I don't think it's necessary that we must suffer that sight. We have not heard from Jennie in 2 years. Until then, we used to get letters from her every once in a while, and then they just stopped." Finally, she thought she could identify her sister's teeth because they were very much like her own, and that included a cavity on the left side of an upper front tooth. When Coroner Mack showed her the teeth, Jennie's sister made the positive identification. On the day Jennie's body was unearthed, it would have been her 18th birthday. Coroner Mack's autopsy brought forth this information. Head is that of a female about 16 or 17 years old. The age is determined by the wisdom teeth, which have perforated the bone, but in life had likely not come through the gum. Long blonde hair is on the scalp. Several of the teeth have large cavities not filled. The trunk is in an advanced state of disintegration, so that it is impossible to be sure that the trunk and head belong together. The sex is not possible to determine by outward examination. On opening up of the abdomen, it is possible to find the uterus. The organ is of natural size and easily distinguishable from the rest of the putrefied mass. Nothing more could be learned by further examination except that the arms taken out of the shoulder joint socket and the legs sawed off at the lower third of the femur. From the examination, it is evident that this person died of unnatural death, but how and by whom cannot be determined by this examination. Jennie's sister, Mrs. Olander, was able to describe how Belle became associated with their family. Jennie was only 8 months old when their mother died. She said her father, Anton Olsen, had known Belle and her first husband, Mad Sorensen, for years. Belle wanted to care for Jennie and take the burden off of Anton, and he agreed for Belle to take Jennie, but he never relinquished claim to her. Jennie's sisters visited her both in their home and Belle and Mad's house in Chicago. Jennie also visited her family after she and Belle moved to Indiana. Likewise, her sisters came to Indiana for visits. The last time Jennie's relatives saw her was 2 years before the fire. Her 2 sisters had been staying in nearby Kingsbury and were driven to the Gunness farm for a visit. They stayed less than an hour, listening to Jennie play the piano and visiting with the children, Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip. Mrs. Olander later explained, quote, "I had no talk with Jennie alone on that visit. She just sat in with all of us. I asked Mrs. Gunness if she wouldn't let Jennie come to visit us sometime and also let me hear from Jennie by mail. She said she would, and that is the last time I saw Jennie or Mrs. Gunness or heard from either of them. I wrote several letters, but got no answer from any of them. Mrs. Gunness never seemed anxious to have Jennie on friendly terms with us. We thought it was jealousy on Mrs. Gunness's part and fear that Jennie would get to liking staying with us. I thought Mrs. Gunness was a good, kindly woman. I always thought until her house burned." By the fall of 1906, Jennie had blossomed into a strikingly pretty 16-year-old. The photo of her was taken around this time. She attracted several male admirers. One admirer was a man named John Widener. He was a LaPorte carriage house worker who had visited her at the Gunness farm. In a later deposition, he told of his friendship with Jennie, quote, "I made Jennie's acquaintance 2 years ago. We were good friends. We never could have much conversation that was not heard by Mrs. Gunness. I have been in Mrs. Gunness's house. Jennie would play the piano and we would talk, but Mrs. Gunness was always present. The last time he saw Jennie alive was about 10 days before Christmas of 1906. She told him she was going to Los Angeles school and would like him to visit her the following Sunday to say goodbye. John Widener said he went. He hired a cutter, and when he got to Mrs. Gunness's, he knocked on the door and asked for Jennie. Mrs. Gunness had kind of a grin on her face and said, quote, "Why, Jennie has gone to Los Angeles." After telling him that Jennie had left the previous Wednesday, she invited him into the house. He said, quote, "I went in and sat down and she introduced me to a fellow who she said was her brother. It seemed as if the fellow couldn't speak English. Anyway, he didn't say much and I couldn't understand him. I came home and picked up a LaPorte Herald in which it said Jennie Olsen had gone with some professor to Los Angeles, California. After that, when I asked her for Jennie's address, she always put me off in some way." Widener also said, "About the middle of October 1907, I met Mrs. Gunness, who said Jennie was going to stay in California and that she had just sent Jennie $100. It was then I wrote Jennie, mailing her the letter to Los Angeles, but the letter came back. When I told Mrs. Gunness this, she said Jennie was away from Los Angeles on vacation, perhaps in San Francisco. The way Mrs. Gunness watched Jennie and me, I thought Jennie knew something about the death of Mr. Gunness, something which Mrs. Gunness did not want her to tell." A similar story was told by Emil Greening of Oklahoma City, who had considered himself Jennie's suitor when he and his brother worked for Belle. Emil was one of Belle's young farm hands. Over the course of his employment at the farm, he and Jennie became close. He said, "She told me a good deal about herself when we were alone." In the winter of 1906, Jennie had told Emil that Belle was sending her to school in California and arranged for one of the professors to come to LaPorte to escort her to school. Shortly before Christmas, Greening heard that the professor had arrived. Early the next morning, he was sent on an errand. When he returned, he had asked to see Jennie so they could say their goodbyes. He said, "Mrs. Gunness told me Jennie had left that same morning, but no one saw her leave and no one about the place ever saw the professor." Greening later said that he thought Belle may have murdered 3 victims a month while he was there, although he knew no specifics. He said, "While I was there, Mrs. Gunness had us dig up large numbers of huge stumps on the farm, and when we refilled the hole, a spot was left." It seemed that Greening's mother also had an opinion. She said one time she was on the farm and she saw Belle wearing a leather sack about the size of a man's hat around her waist. And Belle said to her, "Do you know there is over $5,000 in that sack?" Also during the visit, Mrs. Greening wandered toward the cellar door only to be stopped by Belle, who said, "Don't do that. I never let anybody go into my cellar. That's private property." A conversation between them about a nearby pond was kind of peculiar. Mrs. Greening jokingly suggested that Belle might kill her, row her by boat into the pond, and throw her overboard. Mrs. Greening said Belle turned white as a sheet and she fell back against the wall, only regaining her composure after several minutes. For that reason, Mrs. Greening believed there were bodies in the pond. Belle's mailman, DJ Hunter, also recalled Jennie. He was the mail carrier on Rural McClung Road. He recalled her in this way, quote, "I used to see her often. Late in the afternoon, I would meet her driving home the cows. She was barefoot in the dusty road and wore a faded, torn dress that came only halfway up to her ankles, though she was a grown-up girl. She had wispy hair and big blue eyes. She was shy and serious. I felt sorry for her, and I always made it a point to speak to her. She would say hello, and her eyes would brighten. She seemed pleased to have anyone take notice of her. At times I would see her working out in the garden. She had to work hard. Poor girl. But once or twice, just before time to drive home the cows, I would see her sitting, reading by the fence along the road, and I often wondered what book it was she read." Now with Jennie gone, Emil had no desire to stay there, and in June 1907, 6 months after Jennie left, he quit the farm and headed west. 1 month later, he was replaced by Ray Lamphere. Emil Greening stated that he never knew of Mrs. Gunness bestowing her affections upon any of her hired hands except for Ray Lamphere. He explained, "So many men came and I saw so little of them that I can't remember many of them, but I distinctly remember Mr. Moe, who came from Chicago the day before Christmas, 1906. He was with Mrs. Gunness almost constantly. When he left, his trunk stayed behind and no one saw him. It was several days before Mrs. Gunness admitted he was gone." Greening remembered that shortly afterwards, Mrs. Gunness sent him to Michigan City, which is 12 miles away, to get a horse that she said Moe had promised to give her. He said, "I took a day to make the trip. When I got to Michigan City, something was wrong and I was told to come back for the horse later. But when I returned to the farm, another, quote, cousin who was there when I left was gone. In about 2 weeks, I was again sent to Michigan City, and still there was no horse. But when I got back, another cousin was missing, and no one around the place had seen him leave." Moe's trunk was in the Gunness home on July 11th, 1907 when I left the place. His trunk wasn't the only one. There were about 15 other trunks, and one room was packed full of all kinds of men's clothing. Mrs. Gunness said that the cousins had left their clothes and she wasn't certain that they would be back for them. In the light of what has happened recently, I can see that many bloody and mysterious things were done right under my nose. Emil told how Jennie came to him and declared that she would never go to school in California. He said he wrote her and gave the letters to Mrs. Gunness, but he never received any answer back from Jennie. He said, quote, "I don't believe there was ever a professor, for I slept in the room next to Jennie's and I didn't hear any man's voice. Mrs. Gunness later told me that Jennie had left at 4 o'clock that same morning, but no one saw her leave and no one saw the professor." 3 bodies are now positively identified. Who else will be identified? Stay tuned for episode 5 to learn more of the story. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you would like to hear more.